Hey, what's going on, guys? Alex here, and I wanted to be on camera today because I'm so excited because today Atlus released this video interviewing Katsura Hashino, Shigenori Soejima, and Shoji Meguro talking about the brand new upcoming RPG Metaphor ReFantazio. Now, this is important because, for one, we don't really know a lot about Metaphor apart from the reveal, and two, I'm very curious as to how the direction of the game went from the beginning of its development to now, many years later. And I'm gonna just lay it out for you guys right now. If you're looking for new features, what the story's all about, who the characters are, you're not gonna find that in this video. This is a very high level kind of game design, philosophical kind of deep dive into Metaphor that you might not be used to. So if you're looking for more concrete gameplay details, you're not going to find them here. However, if you're like me and you love behind the scenes stuff and kind of taking a peek into the minds of these creators, I think there's a lot to love here. And again, this is spoiler free because this is all high level. There's a lot of abstraction, so you're not going to be spoiled about the game, but at least you'll get an idea of what to expect from an abstract standpoint. So the video begins with Katsura Hashino, and here he kind of talks about the overall idea behind the game. And he says that the goal of Project ReFantazio from the very beginning was to create a third pillar for the studio. Now he mentions Shin Megami Tensei and Persona as the two other pillars, and he wanted a way to differentiate this new one from those other two by choosing to take on the large-scale epic fantasy RPG. Now that's something that he says they've never done before at Atlus, but I think what he means by that is from his perspective, because if you look all the way back to the PlayStation, Atlus has experimented with fantasy RPGs, but I think what he meant here is that he wanted something that has a unique take on the genre that only his team can actually deliver, and with the kind of experiences that they're taking from making Persona and all the previous games that he's directed. This differentiation, though, implies that both SMT and Persona will just continue to diverge in their designs as they have over the years. Now, I'm curious what that actually means, how both games are going to diverge, because let's face it, they're very similar right now in terms of like the personas and the demons that you kind of encounter in both games. So I'm kind of curious how both of those games are just going to really further separate themselves from what they are right now, if at all possible, if that's really what he means. He also describes Atlus being always focused on modern storytelling, which of course contrasts with everybody else at the time. Even now, there's a lot of focus on fantasy Western RPG tropes that basically means that there's never truly a shortage of that style of RPG. And the reason for that, he says, was that he wanted Atlus to be more counterculture, and that it's a push against what's popular at that time to help define what the voice is for the studio, as he puts it. This time around, when it came time to thinking about fantasy RPGs, utilizing that unique perspective, the entire team had to rethink what one might expect from an Atlus RPG. Like, what does that actually look like if we're coming from SMT and Persona? What is the unique part about an Atlus RPG that stands out? And he mentions that this actually was the most difficult part of the game because each and every one of us have different expectations of what a fantasy RPG could be. So the challenge for him is to try to kind of think of Atlus' unique perspective on RPGs and also mixing it with that fantasy trope and thematic that makes the genre the way that it is, kind of asking what that identity really is. And he also admits that this is actually a very turbulent time during development because they're trying to make something that they've never done before. And just to kind of illustrate, whenever you're in this kind of ideation process, what usually happens is that you have this tendency to either go to one extreme to another. So like, for example, should we set like a medieval RPG in the modern era for some reason? Like, what does that look like? Or a truly medieval RPG with modern elements, like what does that look like, without it having to be ultra modern or ultra medieval. To the name of metaphor, he talks about how metaphor alludes to the hidden meaning of things. And when you really boil down some of the similarities in RPGs, regardless of the genre or the motif, the stories always tie back to how people should live their lives. And there's this kind of idealism that happens when talking, in this fight for what's right that is at the core of a lot of fantasy RPGs. So from that perspective, he went on to talk about how they thought about metaphor and its world. And for one, he kept on asking the question of like, what are the core values of like a fantasy story? Like, what is it really? What does it contain? And the one explanation that Hashino mentioned was actually really beautiful. He says, fantasy does more than immerse us in empty worlds of fiction. They exist because there's something about our world that we want to change, and they help us reimagine something new. Now, this is very interesting because not a lot of people think of fantasy in this way. Like, a lot of us consume a lot of RPGs and stuff because they're fun and they typically tell very engaging stories. But to give you a very good example, the horror genre, like movies, for example, they're typically metaphors for larger societal problems or even political problems. I'm not going to go into politics, don't worry. But if you really think about like what happens in some of these horror movies and thinking of the larger picture of what that actually means, there is something to be said about being able to visualize, metaphorically speaking, these very real social problems and create a story around it that makes people really fear these sorts of situations. To me, is always very fascinating. Horror does that a lot, but also fantasy does that a lot because it's so removed from our regular day-to-day lives. And that one phrase, the fact that there's an opportunity for change and to be able to depict it in such a fantastical way, while still relating it into real life, is the driving force behind Metaphor's design, which affected everything from the story, the characters, the powers, how they'd fight, everything, just everything. As far as the world is concerned, the original design was actually more traditional Western RPG medieval kind of setting. And by its very nature, it kind of forced the path of the game to be more like a conventional fantasy game. So they literally had to just scrap it all entirely, which is what led to the game taking this long. It's a lot of experimentation. So the world then was designed with the modern era in mind, specifically elements of it that the team could bring into a fantasy setting. Now, again, this is a tenuous balance because you don't want it to feel too modern or feel too old. The goal was always to create a connection between the two worlds and not set it in any one of these popular settings, something that lies in between. As far as the main theme of the game goes, Hashino expounded upon this by saying that a lot of the RPGs that he makes usually has a central theme or a core foundation. Now, the first thing that comes to mind to me when he says this is, of course, Persona 4, with its very intense focus on Jungian identity. Now, whether or not they're successful in that, I'll leave it to your opinion. But the bottom line is that they're trying to create something that is familiar to them and not have to second guess themselves on like how other people feel or how other people act, because that would be disingenuous of them to write something beyond their understanding. And in this case, the core of Metaphor is actually about fear. Now, he goes on to describe that fear has existed since the dawn of humanity, something that has existed as part of our shared experience. All of us have faced fear at some point, and fear can paralyze and make a person just crumble because of the weight of pressure that delivers to us. But what's really cool about fear too is that it can lead to strength, using that fear to fuel us, to push people to do their best. And it's something that they have explored in Metaphor. And admittedly, Hashino was actually really scared of this idea because it seemed too simple, right? Like, if our core principle is fear, like, how can we make that interesting? More importantly, he genuinely wants your experience and my experience, a metaphor, to be something meaningful and something that we take away from the game and just kind of apply it to our day-to-day lives. Something that we personally will ask ourselves what it's all about. How does this relate to us? And admittedly, I talked to a lot of people in our comments, and I realized that a lot of us are very consumer heavy. Like, we're just like, oh, what's the next thing? What's the next thing? What's the next thing? And it's very rare for us to actually think about, like, what does this game and its message actually mean to me, and how can I apply that to our day-to-day lives? Granted, this isn't like Sesame Street where everything needs some moral story, but I've always felt that that's something that elevated my love for the games that I've been playing. So, food for thought. So the next part of the interview actually had Shigenori Soejima taking the stage, and this is where he kind of talks about the ideas behind his character designs and the environment design. And at first he started describing the protagonist, and in it he described him as androgynous and heroic, and someone who actually looks like they're about to change the world. The biggest difference in this is that this design will have an emphasis on a firm, resolute gaze. This is very specific, and admittedly, I have no opinion on that because to me, he kind of looks very similar to previous protagonists, and that's not a knock, by the way. I do love the outfit that he created, of course. He went on to talk about Gallica, the fairy, who has this classical fairy design, and he decided to give her a more modern aesthetic. And from that character, they have figured out the kind of ways to style all the other characters in the game and the kind of look and feel that the rest of the NPCs of the world are gonna basically look like. He also went on to talk about how he drew a lot of inspiration from medieval fantasy RPGs, but they didn't just want to rehash our expectations of what those are in modern day. Because much like what Hashino said when they started development and having it lean towards a Western RPG aesthetic, the designers didn't want to just do things that were already done before, because it would basically define the direction that's already been well trodden. And the kind of considerations that they had, the kind of questions they asked were, what feels natural and right to us? And how does it compare to what Atlus has done before? And this led to a lot of experimentation and looking at unconventional choices for inspiration, like looking at fashion trends in the 1960s to figure out how to give these types of fashion its own flavor. There was also a conscious decision to make the environments feel very painterly, and the reason why is because this evoked that feeling of fantasy immediately, compared to the crisp and sharp lines from the Persona games. Of course, the challenge, according to Soejima, is to marry these environments with the designs because they don't want to alienate players too much. When you're designing something new, you don't want things to not be so foreign that players just can't buy into the idea of being in that world. And I think this was really, really smart of him to do. Towards the end, Soejima actually shared the challenges and the kind of questions his team kind of asked during development. Like, what defines an Atlus RPG? Like, what are the aspects of these games should the team consider as their creative identity? Or how do we balance that with newer expectations people might have towards us? And he shared that he feels that the studio's identity has been articulated by fans through Persona, specifically through the stylish menus and the character models, and he expressed this desire to live up to those expectations this time around as well. Right after that, Shoji Meguro took the stage to talk about the music, and for him, he was so excited of the idea of composing songs for a fantasy RPG, so much so that he immediately thought of grand orchestras playing, you know, very epic sounding, very grand, and he thought that this was a great opportunity to write songs that he'd never really written before. But there was a feeling of fear in it too, because you can't just simply throw like an orchestra in a song and call it a day. It is Atlus after all. But overall, like, despite the apprehension, he was like really excited to take on this challenge. So his approach to making the music of this game was to think of music used in religion, but how that relates to a traditional RPG. Like, how can the music of Metaphor give that own unique twist? And he came up with a spiritual music style that evokes still like a classic fantasy feel. And the entire interview is actually filled with a lot of this style of music, and I urge you to check it out even if you just have to listen to the tracks. But here's a sample that they gave in the interview that kind of encapsulates this idea. Ultimately, Meguro wove in scores inspired by hymns and Buddhist prayers, not rap. He actually made mention that nothing rappy, or not rap whatsoever. He also kind of elucidated his thoughts about game music, and I thought this was really, really interesting. He talked about how the soundtrack serves as a connection point between the player and the world that they're inhabiting in the game. Now, while the songs are typically thought of as a means to capture and convey the feeling of the story to the player, and this is interesting, it's worth considering and remembering that the players in the world can't hear these songs, right? And he went on to say that in this sense, I've always considered game scores to be similar to UI elements, which are constructs that exist solely to service the player. This was so fascinating to me. Like, a lot of what he says makes a lot of sense, but I've always thought of music with regards to my relationship with it in movies and TV. Now, thinking of it as a UI element reframes it in a way, because game scores can be more interactive depending on what you do. One interesting thing that Meguro shared as well is that he spoke a lot with Hashino and talked about how the score could also link back to the quote-unquote music the characters are experiencing in their minds, especially in each scene, which would help dictate the kinds of music that said moment would require. Meguro even goes so far as to say that these moments are thought experiments. This isn't literal. There isn't actually a music playing in people's heads, but rather it's a way to represent the thought processes of each character in each scene, which will help dictate the kinds of music that moment would require. Now, it sounds like 2 or 3 levels removed from the straightforwardness of composing music in each scene, but I think adding these different levels inadvertently adds levels of depth to the compositions as well. And finally, he ended the segment by saying he feels that his work on Metaphor is the best that he's ever done for Atlus, and that the entire team put their heart and soul into this project. Now, what does this all mean? Because we've probably gone on longer than the original interview itself. So I'm going to try to summarize everything if you don't want to rewatch like the whole thing or watch the actual interview. Ultimately, Metaphor is going to be all about fear and what we do with that fear as either fuel or to succumb to it through our own weaknesses. Throughout development, the developers struggled to try to find the right medium between the modern world and traditional medieval fantasy, but is convinced that they managed to find that harmony between the two, that right, exact, perfect moment that makes Metaphor the way that it is. They've also been inspired by many different things, including 60s fashion, which that was really surprising to me as well. It's in this sense that Metaphor ReFantazio is taking a very, very big swing here that I'm actually really genuinely excited about, especially after hearing what they had to say here. It feels fresh to me like no other JRPG has made me feel before, where it's just taking on its own path that is familiar yet new. And it's so fascinating to me that, you know, after being in hushed secrecy for so many years, that we're finally almost there, because the game is coming out next year and I can't wait to play it. But with all that said, I want to hear what you think of the game. Post your thoughts in the comments below and share with me what you think of these like highfalutin ideas. And I hope that this video gave you a really good insight and a good peek as to what the goals of this game are. So until next time, I'll see you guys later. Happy gaming.